The evening train rattled along the tracks, its metal wheels screeching at every turn as exhausted passengers swayed with the motion. The air inside the carriage felt heavy, thick with silence and unspoken tension. Alina sat near the window, clutching her handbag tightly against her chest, her reflection faintly visible in the darkened glass. She had boarded just 3 stops ago, hoping to reach home quietly after a draining shift at work. Instead, she found herself trapped in a situation that made her pulse race. A man, standing too close, kept shifting nearer despite the available space around him. At first she convinced herself it was accidental, just the crowd pressing in. But then came the deliberate brushing of his arm against hers, the invasive stare that lingered far too long, and the low murmurs that made her stomach twist. She leaned toward the window, shrinking into herself, silently pleading for the next station to arrive faster. Around her, passengers pretended not to notice. Some wore headphones, others stared blankly at their phones. The train's clattering seemed to drown out her discomfort. The man bent slightly, whispering something inappropriate near her ear, his breath hot and unwelcome. Alina's throat tightened. She wanted to speak, to shout, but fear glued her voice in place. Her fingers trembled as she texted her sister, typing only 2 words, "Call me." A few seats away sat Daniel, a single father, returning home with his young daughter asleep against his shoulder. He had mastered the art of awareness since becoming both mother and father to his child. When he noticed Alina's rigid posture and the stranger's invasive stance, his protective instinct stirred instantly. He saw the way her eyes darted around the carriage, silently asking for help. His daughter shifted in her sleep, and Daniel gently adjusted her before standing up. His heart pounded, not from fear, but from certainty. He could not let his child grow up believing silence was acceptable in the face of wrongdoing. Carefully placing his daughter in his vacated seat, Daniel stepped forward and positioned himself between Alina and the man. His presence was firm, unyielding. In a steady voice that carried across the carriage, he asked, "Is there a problem here?" The question hung in the air, and suddenly everyone was listening. The question lingered in the air like a sudden crack of thunder. "Is there a problem here?" Daniel's voice was calm, but it carried a firmness that demanded attention. The man who had been harassing Alina straightened immediately, clearly caught off guard. For a brief second, he tried to laugh it off, shrugging as though nothing unusual had happened. "No problem," he muttered. "We were just talking." Alina's eyes widened. Talking, the word felt like a cruel distortion of what had just taken place. She opened her mouth to speak, but hesitated, the familiar weight of doubt creeping in. What if no one believed her? What if it only made things worse? Daniel didn't move. He stood tall, creating a protective barrier between her and the stranger. "She doesn't look comfortable," he replied evenly. His tone wasn't aggressive, but it left no room for argument. The train car had grown unusually quiet. A few passengers who had earlier buried their faces in their phones were now watching openly. The silence that once protected the harasser was beginning to dissolve. The man scoffed, attempting to regain control of the situation. "Mind your own business." Daniel's jaw tightened, but he remained composed. "It became my business the moment she looked scared." His words were simple, yet they carried undeniable weight. He wasn't just defending Elena, he was setting an example for his daughter, who sat watching with wide, observant eyes. Encouraged by Daniel's presence, Alina finally found her voice. "I asked him to step back," she said quietly, her words trembling, but clear. "He wouldn't." That was enough. A middle-aged woman, across the aisle, nodded firmly. "I saw him leaning too close," she added. Another passenger chimed in, saying the man had been bothering her since the last station. The tide had shifted. What had moments ago felt isolating now felt supported. Realizing the attention was no longer in his favor, the harasser muttered something under his breath and moved toward the other end of the carriage. The train slowed as it approached the next station, and when the doors opened, he stepped off without looking back. As the doors closed again, a collective breath seemed to release inside the compartment. Daniel turned slightly toward Alina. "Are you okay?" he asked gently. For the first time since boarding, she nodded because now she truly was. As the train pulled away from the station, the tension that had gripped the carriage slowly melted into a quiet, reflective calm. Conversations resumed in low murmurs, but something had shifted. The invisible wall of silence that once separated strangers had cracked. Alina exhaled deeply, her hands still trembling slightly as the adrenaline faded. She hadn't realized how tightly she had been holding her breath until now. Daniel returned to his seat, kneeling briefly in front of his daughter. "You okay, sweetheart?" he asked softly. The little girl nodded, her wide eyes still fixed on Alina. "Daddy," she whispered, "that man was being mean." Daniel brushed a strand of hair from her face. "Yes," he said gently. "And when someone is being mean or making someone feel unsafe, we don't ignore it." His words weren't loud, but they carried meaning beyond the moment. They were a lesson, not just for his daughter, but for anyone still listening. Alina watched them, her heart swelling with gratitude, gathering her courage. She leaned slightly toward Daniel. "Thank you," she said, her voice steadier now. "I didn't know what to do." "You shouldn't have to handle that alone," Daniel replied. "No one should." There was no heroism in his tone, no expectation of praise. To him, it had simply been the right thing to do. A woman across the aisle offered Alina a reassuring smile. Another passenger gave a small nod of approval. The shared silence earlier had been replaced with subtle solidarity. It wasn't dramatic or loud, but it mattered. As the train approached Alina's stop, she stood, adjusting her bag over her shoulder. She hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "Your daughter is lucky to have you," she said, sincerely. Daniel smiled faintly. "I'm the lucky one." When the doors opened, Alina stepped off onto the platform, the cool night air brushing against her face. She felt lighter, not because the world had suddenly become safer, but because she had witnessed proof that courage still existed within it. Inside the train, Daniel's daughter slipped her small hand into his. "Daddy," she said softly, "I want to be brave like you." Daniel squeezed her hand gently. As the train moved forward into the night, "You already are."